Well, let's get talking now. Concerned by the rising state of Nigeria's debt profile, the International Monetary Fund has warned the Central Bank of Nigeria against constantly bailing out governments in their quest to borrow funds outside the bond market. The IMF report titled Rethinking Monetary Policy in a Changing World maintains that monetizing excessive government debt needs to be stopped as to reduce liquidity in the money market, which will drastically tame inflation as well as enable them freely set interest rates and pursue their objectives independent of fiscal policy. It will interest you to know that the 23.7 trillion debt the government owes the Central Bank of Nigeria through Ways and Means financing has been a topic for debate since last year. To give more insights into this development and contending issues, I'm being joined live via Zoom. He's a global economic consultant. He's an entrepreneur, public policy analyst, and a development economist, Professor Ken Ife. Professor Ife, thank you so much. It's good to have you on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, Prof, let me start with the 11.34 trillion, which is projected that our fiscal deficit of 2023 will hit. And this will be financed through deficit financing method. We're already talking about debt service here. First, what is your reaction to that comment by one of the members of the Monetary Committee saying that this fiscal challenge will continue?
Well, without a doubt, it will not go away. The fiscal challenges will not go away overnight. Because don't forget, it started for quite some time. It went deeper in 2020 during the Covid19, when we had to throw everything at the recession to make sure we get out of it, and we did within a quarter. So there was a massive spending, one in terms of getting you out of recession, but also we had to get into the other side of the spend to enable the capacity to buy, which is increasing and boosting aggregate demand. Because one thing is to say to manufacturers, come and take money, increase the output. The other one is to say, who are the consumers? You need money to come and buy whatever you can, especially when many people were thrown out of their jobs. So there was something. But then that is also came on top of an existing debt profile that was already rising. And then finally, you also now had the central bank overdraft to government that also increased beyond the normal expected levels. So all of them have increased the debt exposure, and that hasn't ended because we still have government committed to building more infrastructure, because our debt of infrastructure is only 35% compared to South Africa, that's over 80%. And that that infrastructure is very critical to inviting domestic investment and foreign investment, because they are not going to borrow money to come and build your infrastructure. They're borrowing money to come and build their business. And they don't want to get into this business of infrastructure, except it is a special PPP arrangement. So in short, those problems won't go away, but there's a lot of aggressive response from government departments, especially the Ministry of Finance, on revenue generation, because this is where the vulnerability is, to ensure that we can ramp up revenue to be able to withstand the debt services that are contingent.
You identified COVID-19 pandemic, which actually changed the dynamics there. Of course, the disruption, movement of goods and services across the world, and of course, there was spending to try to cover up lost grounds. But I wanted to ask you, what would have been the option? Countries would have no choice than to borrow when issues like that pop up, Prof.
No, when you have issues that are unexpected, then people normally say, okay, where do we get money? You go for your savings to unlock some of your savings and bring them into the fray. But where you don't have those national savings, then what do? You just have to go out borrowing. And then who goes out borrowing goes out sorrowing. That's the lesson that we'll learn. So the thing is that we didn't have as much. And we're now beginning to build national savings through a variety of savings schemes. You've seen the pension growing to almost 15 trillion now. And then you see national savings schemes coming up. So over time, they will bring some cushion. And then, of course, you also saw that Ministry of Finance Incorporated has been set up. with the three layers of the executive management, the board, and the council, the governing council. So they're all going out to sweat the assets of federal government and then, invest more of these and then manage them with a very, very, very modern company that will do what needs to be done. And they have a very aggressive target as well. The president says, go and raise 100 trillion in the next few years. So that's an important work response to the challenges that we have.
When we contend with fiscal challenges like this, Prof, I want to ask, many suggest or analysts suggest that there is always either need to cut spending or some would say you increase taxes. But in this part of the world, many will say, no, increasing taxes might not be the way out. So what do you think about cost of governance and other ways that we could source revenue to bridge this deficit gap?
You see, when you have a chronic level of unemployment, as much as 33%, 33.5% average, and then when you look at young people under 35 years, is 48% for them and 22% underemployed, so 70%. You have to be very careful because you might be throwing more people into the unemployment by heavily overtaxing those few businesses that are already within your net. So what you need to do is to expand the net so that you can bring more people under taxation. Then you also look at the workers. A lot of the workers that are taxed are government workers. You can't go on like that because they also are looking for minimum wage to be increased. Things are so hard. So you also need to insulate them to some extent in a massive tax increase. And then also you have to consider the most critical element, which is that companies and what they call implicit tax. Implicit tax is, even though on paper you are 30% tax and 10% that, but the implicit tax is what is the real tax to the business. If you look at companies, there's a survey that says that 68% of companies, manufacturers, say that they provide their own power 90% of the time. So it means that companies are providing their own power through generators. They are now having to find their own water, do their own borehole. They have high costs of petrol and things and diesel. So there's a lot of costs so these are implicit tax. So you can see some companies beginning to bugger off from the country because they just find it too much. And when you come to those, and also look at the taxes too, you have education tax that's gone to 3%. You have ITF tax, 1%. You have stamp duty. You have quite a few taxes there, there. So we have to be careful how much we are adding to the bill.
Very importantly, so let's now look at the other available options. Some will say the stock market should also be somewhere that we could go to when we need funding. Talk about infrastructure funds and all of that instead of borrowing. How well are we synergizing, taking advantage of our stock market to build infrastructure or develop our economy?
Well, I know that the Finance Act has something there on the capital market because they are moving in, they are looking at other possibilities there. And I also know that the capital gains tax is something that was brought into the Finance Act 2022. So government has not been, they have been looking at widening the tax base from the perspective of the capital market. So they've been looking at that.
How worried are you with regards to this very message from the IMF this time around? We mentioned about the ways and means too, augmented by the CBN, which is also generating comments, more than 22 trillion naira. How worried are you? What does it mean for us in your thoughts, Prof?
Now, the IMF, what has happened now is that there's a lot of global headwinds that are playing into the whole calculus. One is you have a general rise in inflation all over the world. Let me put it this way. all the central banks in the world know a lot about inflation. And they already all have various strategies that they use, especially more expansionary, contractionally, to deal with inflation. Now, every bank in the world also know how to deal with recession. And those recession measures tends to include a lot of expansionary policy and all of that. But what they don't know is how to deal with stagflation. Stagflation is where inflation is going up and then the recession is also coming up. Both of them supposed to be running in opposite direction. But now both of them are going in the same direction and it's up, up, up. So they don't know how to deal with this. So IMF can't actually tell developing countries, emerging countries what to do. There's no such thing as prescription. Let me take one case. Apart from the global ones that we know, that quantitative easing has ended in most countries and they are now beginning to ramp up on those. Because of high inflation, you've seen the likes of Fed beginning to raise MPR rates. You have also seen, so measures are all pushing towards increasing it to suppress demand and to reduce the liquidity in the system, because a lot of money has been thrown at the challenges we had in 2020 going forward. The second one, that's the heavy debt burden. And when these rates are going up, it is increasing the debt service. So many countries, especially the developing ones, are borrowing so much money and are having bigger exposure. So that is part of the external one. But you now come to particular countries, you've seen that there are different macroeconomic objectives for different countries. In the US, their own objective is financial system, price stability and employment. But in Nigeria is price stability, financial system stability, and then also you have an additional one, which is to promote sustainable development. And so the likes of central bank will use the instruments that they have, monetary instruments, to ensure that there is a cocktail of policy, monetary policy mix that promotes sustainable growth, promote diversification of our economy, promote employment in the economy. How would you tell young people only 7% of graduates get jobs in Nigeria? And how would you tell them that they will live with 70% of them unemployed or underemployed? You can't live with that. And then how would you tell people that you will no longer invest in infrastructure because you are trying to cut back federal expense? If you don't invest in infrastructure, where are you going to create the jobs? Neither is it that we expect government to create jobs anyway. It's still going to be private sector that will create jobs. So there are some of those things that you can't help. So if you, as I said, if you don't have the savings, you just have to go borrowing. But what happens is this: there's nothing wrong in borrowing, provided that you are borrowing sensibly, and according to the Fiscal Responsibility Act 2007, you borrow for long term and at concessionary rates and with a good measure of cost-benefit analysis that adds up. In other words, take the money, but ensure that it is accountable, that it is going to be able to repay itself, and that is going to promote economic growth. There's nothing in that law that says you should borrow money to spend on salaries. Nothing in that law says you should borrow money to distribute to people. No, that is not FR 2007. That's not it.
Now, this move by the Apex Bank, and of course, like you likened it to other countries, increasing rates to tame inflation. Some analysts are saying that seems not to be working here in Nigeria. Maybe we have a transition period. You will explain that to us. But my argument is, the central bank has said, if this persists, that if inflation continues to go higher, they will continue to fight it with increasing the MPR. But some say there is supposed to be a proper handshake between the fiscal and the monetary side to complement some of these moves by the Apex Bank. And that is why we're having this challenge. What is your reaction to these two sentiments?
Now, there are three challenges. One is that I've already talked about the global headwinds, how those are impacting on monetary policy at home. I've talked about those, gave you the examples of what's happening with Russia, the rising prices of gas, and of course the grains and all of that. Okay, but when you come into a country you begin to look at what other things are so peculiar to these economies. In the case of Nigeria, we know that structural factors are so predominant. We know that the level of insecurity is also discouraging investment. And then when you don't have investment, you're actually stuck, because the real cycle is investment will come, they will create economic activity. Those economic activities will create employment, disposable income. From disposable income, you can pay for health, education, and then sustainably reduce poverty. So if you exclude investment from the equation, then you're talking to somebody else. You're not talking to the economy of the country. So then when you come down further, you find out that in a country like Nigeria, the transmission of monetary policy is such a problem, because you have a case where 3.3 trillion was supposed to be in circulation, and about 80% of it were sitting under people's pillows and dug in somewhere. And so what happens is that the amount of money available to commercial banks to lend is just restricted. So if this 2.7 trillion that is out there is available for the banks to lend, they will create more economic activities and then actually earn some money, 9% or 10% for the owners of that money. Now, the second point is that if central bank wants to constrain liquidity and is targeting the banks with the liquidity that they have, you are actually making it more difficult for the banks to lend money, because already 32.5% of their money is in cash reserve ratio in the central bank and not earning them any interest. Then you have 30% of their money that is going to be held as for liquidity ratio. So what is it that the banks have? And you also have loan to deposit ratio of 60%. So that capital, the private sector will lend. They haven't got anything to lend. So whatever it is that is left with the banks to lend, they will have to lend it at an extremely high rate. Already the benchmark is the monetary policy rate, which is 18.5%. So you can see that they are boxed into economy. But if all those monies that are hanging out there are to come in, then the banks have money to lend to promote and support economic activity. So these are some of the dilemmas. So there is a problem with transmission of monetary policy. And then, of course, remember that over 30% of our people are not even in the banking system. And then quite a lot of the young people are leaving the banking system for cryptocurrencies. So who are the people banking? And where are the money? So the money is neither here in the banking system, nor are the people who are actually having the money even into the banking system. So we have all that kind of challenges, plus insecurity, of course, are peculiar to Nigeria. So when you are looking at the monetary policy from Nigeria perspective, it's not going to be one of the things that are prescribed by IMF. It has to be real. And then thirdly, the whole world economies always cooperate and collaborate on fiscal measures. That's why you have regional integration agenda, regional connectivity of infrastructure, all that stuff. Very little cooperation among global actors on monetary policy has actually been taking place. So now we have to have more coordination and more alignment, more of the regional players beginning to talk about monetary policy, in a global scale. That hasn't been happening. So they need to begin to have more sense of how they can go together to get some traction on the monetary policy side. So it's a bit difficult. So IMF cannot be prescriptive to any of the developed emerging countries on what they have to do. But their policy mix are very peculiar to the individual countries, even though we know that the global headwinds are already dictating the pace, the global pace. And that pace means more inflation, and then more rises in MPR rates and all that type of thing.
Prof, it's a good way to leave it. I must thank you so much for your time. I've been speaking to global economic consultant, entrepreneur, public policy analyst, development economist, Professor Kenife. Thank you so much. A lot in the plate for us to chew. We're going to continue these discussions because there's a lot, of course, around Nigeria's monetary policy. Thank you so much, Prof, for your time. We appreciate this.
Thank you.